In the year 1884, the newspapers across Europe were celebrating something extraordinary. Not a military conquest, not a trade deal, but what they're calling a humanitarian breakthrough in the heart of Africa. The man behind it? King Leopold II of Belgium. But here's what makes this different from every other European power grab happening at the time. Leopold isn't presenting himself as a conqueror. He's presenting himself as a savior. He stands before the world's most powerful nations and makes a promise. His new African territory will be a refuge for the oppressed, a place where slavery, still rampant in parts of Africa, will be abolished, where civilization will be brought not through force, but through progress, where lives will be saved, not destroyed. The European elite eat it up. Humanitarian groups praise him. Religious leaders support him. Even the United States endorses his mission. But there's something the newspapers don't mention, something that should have raised every red flag imaginable. This land, this massive territory, 76 times the size of Belgium itself, doesn't belong to the Belgian government. It doesn't belong to any nation. It belongs to him, personally. One man, one king, owner of an entire country, not a colony, not a protectorate, his private property, and he called it the Congo Free State. Free. The world applauded. They called it enlightened, progressive, a model for the future of Africa. They had no idea what was coming. Because if this really was a humanitarian mission, if Leopold truly wanted to save lives and end suffering, why did he demand absolute secrecy about what happened inside? Let's be clear about what just happened. In 1885, the most powerful nations on Earth gathered in Berlin and formally recognized something that had never existed before in modern history and has never existed since. A country owned by one man, not ruled by, owned by. No constitution, no parliament, no elected officials, no checks, no balances, no oversight from Belgium or any other government, just one king, sitting in a palace in Brussels, with absolute authority over a territory nearly as large as Western Europe. So how did he pull this off? How did Leopold convince the world's superpowers to hand him an empire? Simple. He lied brilliantly. He promised free trade. No European nation would be locked out economically. He promised to end the Arab slave trade that operated in the region. He positioned himself as the neutral party, the humanitarian who didn't have the selfish colonial ambitions of Britain, France, or Germany, and they believed him. The United States was the first to officially recognize the Congo Free State. The others followed. But Leopold wasn't interested in ending slavery. He was interested in rubber. In the 1890s, rubber became the oil of the industrial age. The world suddenly needed it for everything: tires, insulation, hoses, machinery. And the Congo rainforest was full of wild rubber vines. Leopold didn't see a country, he saw a factory. And the Congolese people? They weren't citizens, they were labor. A system was created, cold, efficient, and merciless. Villages were assigned rubber quotas, impossible quotas. Every 2 weeks, each village had to deliver a set amount of raw rubber to Leopold's agents. No payment, no negotiation, just the quota. Now, you might think failure to meet these quotas meant punishment. A fine, maybe. Imprisonment. No. Failure meant disappearance. Entire villages, gone, erased. Because Leopold understood something fundamental about control. Fear is only effective if it's visible. If people see what happens when you resist. So he didn't just punish resistance, he made an example of it. And then he solved the problem of resistance. Permanently. Every empire needs enforcers, men who carry out orders without question, men who make sure the system runs smoothly. Leopold had his. They were called the Force Publique. But don't mistake them for a traditional army. These weren't soldiers defending a nation. They were mercenaries protecting a profit margin. Most were conscripted, kidnapped from their homes or recruited from rival ethnic groups, deliberately chosen so they'd have no sympathy for the people they'd be sent to control. Others were criminals given a choice, prison or the force. Their European officers? Many were the kind of men who couldn't get military commissions in their own countries, drifters, failures, men drawn to places where cruelty had no consequences, and they were armed, given rifles, given authority, given one very specific job: make sure the rubber keeps flowing. But Leopold had a problem. Bullets were expensive, and in a private empire where every franc mattered, he needed to ensure his ammunition wasn't being wasted, used for hunting, sold off, or fired randomly into the jungle. So he implemented a rule. For every bullet fired, the Force Publique had to provide proof it had been used to enforce the quota. That proof was a human hand. Right hand, left hand. It didn't matter. One bullet, one hand. Baskets of them were collected, smoked to preserve them, and delivered to officers as evidence. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was accounting. But the system had another layer. Because even fear has limits. Even terror can't force a man into the jungle for weeks at a time, harvesting rubber until his hands bleed unless you give him a reason he cannot ignore. So they took the women, the children, villages were raided, wives, daughters, sons, rounded up and held in camps. The message was simple: bring rubber or you'll never see them again. Men had no choice. They went into the jungle. Days, weeks, some never came back. You need to understand something. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't random violence spiraling out of control. This was designed, planned, refined. A system with logistics, accountability, and optimization. Leopold ran the Congo the way a factory manager runs a production line. And when production fell, you didn't fix the equipment. You replaced the workers. In 1899, one officer, a Swedish man named Edgar Stannard, began writing letters home. Letters that questioned what he was seeing. Letters that described something he couldn't reconcile with the humanitarian mission he'd been told he was part of. He was starting to realize the truth. But before we learn what happened to him, we need to understand what was happening in the villages. Because what began as a system of control, efficient, calculated, brutal, had quietly become something else. In 1880, before Leopold took control, the population of the Congo Basin was estimated at around 20 million people. By 1920, less than 40 years later, it had been cut in half. 10 million people. Gone. Some historians say it was more, 15 million. Others argue we'll never know the true number because no one was counting. Leopold made sure of that. But here's what we do know. This wasn't a decline. It wasn't a gradual demographic shift. This was a collapse. Entire regions depopulated. Villages that had existed for generations wiped off the map. Families, clans, cultures erased. And it wasn't just the bullets. It wasn't just the hands. Those were symptoms of a larger machine. When men were forced into the jungle for weeks to harvest rubber, no one was left to plant crops. Famine spread. When villages were burned for missing quotas, survivors fled into the forest, where disease, starvation, and violence from other displaced groups killed them. Sleeping sickness, smallpox, dysentery. These epidemics ravaged the population, not because they were inevitable, but because Leopold's system destroyed the social structures that might have contained them. These weren't accidents. They were side effects, predictable, expected, and ignored. Because across the ocean, the rubber kept flowing, the profits kept climbing, and the Congo Free State became one of the most lucrative ventures in the world. Leopold personally made a fortune equivalent to over $1 billion in today's money. So why didn't anyone stop him? Because stopping him would have required three things the world wasn't willing to give: attention, evidence, and accountability. First, distance. The Congo was remote, or inaccessible, thousands of miles from the centers of power. What happened there felt abstract, distant, unreal. Second, complicity. European powers and the United States had recognized Leopold's claim. To intervene now would mean admitting they'd been duped, or worse, that they hadn't cared. And third, profit. European and American companies were buying Congolese rubber, cheap, abundant, blood-soaked rubber. They didn't ask questions. They didn't want to know. There were rumors, of course, whispers in diplomatic circles, reports from missionaries that something wasn't right. But suspicion isn't action. And Leopold was a master at plausible deniability. He controlled who entered the Congo. He controlled the information that left it. When accusations surfaced, he denied everything, called it slander, pointed to his humanitarian charter. La sent investigators he'd personally selected who, surprise, found nothing wrong. The system was designed to be invisible. Until it wasn't. In the early 1900s, photographs began to escape the Congo, not paintings, not sketches, not second-hand accounts, photographs, proof, undeniable, unforgettable. These images did what 1,000 reports couldn't. They made the horror real. They made it visible. They spread across Europe and America, reproduced in newspapers, displayed at public lectures, passed from hand to hand in churches and meeting halls, and suddenly the world couldn't look away. Leopold's greatest fear had come true. The secret was out. February 1904. A letter arrives at the British Foreign Office in London. It's from Roger Casement, a British diplomat stationed in the Congo, a man who'd spent years in Africa, a man who'd seen things he could no longer stay silent about. The letter is 20 pages long, methodical, detailed, horrifying. It describes villages burned to ash, children with their hands cut off, women held hostage, mass graves, a system of terror so vast, so deliberate, that Casement struggles to find words adequate to convey it. He ends with a single request: investigate. That letter changed everything, because Casement wasn't the first to speak out, but he was the one people couldn't ignore. A respected diplomat, a British subject, not some distant missionary whose claims could be dismissed as exaggeration. But he wasn't alone. Missionaries had been sounding the alarm for years, men like William Shepard and William Morrison, American Presbyterians who documented atrocities and sent reports home, only to be ignored or accused of meddling. Then there was Edmund Dean Morrell, a British shipping clerk who noticed something odd. Ships leaving Europe for the Congo were loaded with guns and ammunition. Ships returning were loaded with rubber and ivory. But there was no trade going the other way. No wages being paid, no goods being exchanged, which meant one thing. The Congolese weren't being paid. They were being forced. Morrell quit his job, dedicated his life to exposing Leopold. He wrote books, gave speeches, published a newspaper, the West African Mail, that relentlessly documented the abuses. And slowly, the movement grew. What started as a few voices became a chorus: church groups, labor unions, intellectuals. This was one of the first international human rights campaigns in history, before the term human rights even existed. And Mark Twain wrote a scathing satire called King Leopold's Soliloquy, a biting monologue where Leopold admits to everything while mocking the world's inaction. In 14 years, Leopold has deliberately destroyed more lives than have suffered death on all the battlefields of this planet for the past 1,000 years. Arthur Conan Doyle published The Crime of the Congo, a book filled with photographs, testimonies, and evidence. He called it what it was: a crime against humanity. The pressure mounted. Tens of thousands of people signed petitions demanding action. Newspapers that had once praised Leopold now called him a tyrant. Governments that had endorsed him began to squirm. And Leopold, he denied everything. He called the accusations lies, slander from jealous competitors and meddling missionaries. He published his own counter-reports. He hired his own investigators and flooded newspapers with propaganda portraying himself as a misunderstood benefactor. He even launched one of the first modern PR campaigns, hiring lobbyists in the US and Europe to defend his reputation, bribing journalists, planting favorable stories. But the evidence kept coming: the photographs, the testimonies, the bodies. Finally, in 1904, the pressure became too great. The British government announced it would send an official commission to the Congo to investigate the claims. 3 men, neutral observers, tasked with finding the truth. But here's the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What would they find? And more importantly, what would they be allowed to see? Months passed. The world waited. Rumors circulated. Some said the commission had been bought off. Others said Leopold had cleaned up the worst abuses before they arrived. Still others believed the investigators were genuinely shocked by what they'd seen. In 1905, the report was published, and it confirmed everything. The atrocities were real, systematic, widespread, undeniable. The world had its proof. The pressure on Leopold became unbearable. Belgium itself, his own country, grew embarrassed, furious that their king had brought them international shame. In 1908, the Belgian parliament forced Leopold's hand. He was ordered to relinquish control of the Congo. The Congo Free State would become the Belgian Congo, no longer his personal property, now a colony under government oversight. The world celebrated. The whistleblowers claimed victory. Leopold's empire had fallen. But here's what they didn't realize. Leopold had already won. Because the decision wasn't justice, it was a transaction. November 15th, 1908. The Belgian parliament votes to annex the Congo Free State. Leopold's private empire officially dissolved. The headlines called it a victory for humanity, the end of a dark chapter. Justice finally served. But let's be very clear about what actually happened. Leopold didn't give up the Congo because he had a change of heart. He didn't surrender out of guilt or shame. He negotiated. In exchange for transferring ownership to Belgium, Leopold received a payment of 50 million francs, roughly $1.1 billion in today's money. Plus, the Belgian government agreed to assume his debts, which, conveniently, included vast construction projects he'd personally profited from. He'd already extracted a fortune from the Congo. Now he was being compensated for losing access to it. This wasn't justice, it was a buyout. And with that transaction, the experiment officially ended. The Congo Free State ceased to exist. Belgium took over, promised reforms, oversight, accountability. And then something remarkable happened. Records began to disappear. Before Leopold died in 1909, he ordered the destruction of most of his personal archives related to the Congo. Letters, ledgers, reports, orders, burned, gone. The Belgian government did the same. Sensitive documents were classified, hidden, or destroyed. For decades, researchers trying to piece together the full scope of what happened were blocked at every turn. And the language changed. What had been called atrocities became excesses. What had been systematic terror became unfortunate abuses by rogue officers. What had been policy became isolated incidents blown out of proportion by foreign critics. Belgium rebranded the entire operation. They framed themselves as the rescuers, the ones who stepped in to clean up Leopold's mess. They promised a humane colonialism, development, progress. And to be fair, some things did change. The worst of the mutilations stopped. The overt brutality was reined in. The quota system was reformed, on paper. But here's the problem. Banning the Congo Free State didn't erase it. The structure remained. Forced labor continued, just under new names. Taxation in kind. Mandatory cultivation. Civic duty. The rubber quotas became cotton quotas, palm oil quotas, mineral quotas. And as the 20th century progressed, the Congo's resources became even more valuable. Copper, diamonds, uranium, the very uranium used in the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from the Belgian Congo. The Congolese people were still extracting wealth for others, still working under coercion, still dying in the process. The experiment hadn't failed. It had succeeded so completely that it became the blueprint. Other colonial powers looked at what Leopold had done, not with horror, but with envy. They adopted similar methods, wrapped them in softer language, justified them with the same rhetoric of civilization and progress. Forced labor became contract labor. Theft became taxation. Occupation became development. In 1908, the world celebrated the end of Leopold's reign as if closing a chapter in a history book. But the methods he perfected, they didn't disappear. They evolved. Because the Congo Free State was never really banned. It was just renamed. In 1910, just 2 years after the Congo Free State is dissolved, across Africa, colonial powers are watching, taking notes. They'd condemned Leopold publicly, called his methods barbaric, signed treaties promising to do better, and then they copied him. In French Equatorial Africa, forced labor for rubber and timber becomes standard practice. Villages are assigned quotas. Those who resist face collective punishment. In British Kenya, the the colonial government introduces hut taxes and poll taxes, designed specifically so Africans can't pay them in cash. The only option? Work on European-owned plantations for little or no wages. In Portuguese Angola, a system called chibalo, forced labor, becomes official policy. Africans are contracted to work on coffee and cotton plantations, contracted, not enslaved. The language matters. The reality doesn't change. In German Southwest Africa, what we now call Namibia, colonial authorities go even further. When the Herero and Nama people resist German land seizures, the response is systematic extermination. Concentration camps, forced labor until death, genocide, the methods Leopold pioneered. Control through terror, extraction through coercion, profit through dehumanization becomes standard operating procedure. What was banned in name lived on in practice. But here's what made it sustainable: bureaucracy. Violence became paperwork, terror became policy, atrocity became administration. You didn't need to send soldiers into villages with machetes anymore. You just needed a tax collector, a labor recruiter, a development officer. The system became invisible, normalized. You could participate in it without ever seeing blood on your hands. Families moved to the colonies, built lives, raised children who grew up thinking this was just how things worked. And back in Europe, the Congo Free State was taught, if it was taught at all, as an anomaly, a madman's folly, an exception, not as an experiment, not as a prototype, not as the moment modern extraction economics found its perfect laboratory. Because calling it an experiment would mean admitting something uncomfortable. It would mean admitting it worked. The Congo remained one of the most resource-rich places on Earth. Rubber gave way to copper. Copper to cobalt and coltan, minerals essential for electronics, batteries, smartphones. And through every transition, colonial rule to independence in 1960, independence to dictatorship, dictatorship to ongoing conflict, the extraction never stopped. Different flags, different corporations, different governments, same system. Because what Leopold proved wasn't just that you could extract maximum profit from a place and its people with minimal investment. He proved you could do it indefinitely, as long as you controlled the narrative, as long as you burned the records, as long as you rewrote the story, as long as you made sure the next generation forgot what happened or never learned it in the first place. So here's the question history refuses to ask. What if the Congo Free State wasn't a mistake? What if it wasn't an aberration, a moral failure, a cautionary tale? What if it was exactly what it looked like? A test run, a proof of concept, a blueprint for how to strip a place of everything it has, its resources, its labor, its dignity, and call it progress. And if that's true, if Leopold's experiment didn't end in 1908 but simply evolved, adapted, went underground, then the most terrifying question isn't what happened in the Congo. It's what's still happening. Let me ask you a question. When you were in school, did anyone teach you about the Congo Free State? Most people say no. In most Western school systems, if the Congo is mentioned at all, it's a footnote, a paragraph, maybe a single sentence about colonial abuses tucked between chapters on World War I and the Industrial Revolution. But here's what we do teach: the Holocaust. And we should. It was one of the greatest crimes in human history. 6 million Jews systematically murdered. We build memorials. We require students to study it. We say, never again. And that's right. That's necessary. But in the Congo, 10 million people died. Maybe more. 10 million. So why the silence? Why is there no equivalent education? No memorials in Brussels? No International Day of Remembrance? Why can you walk through Belgium today and see statues of Leopold still standing, honored, not condemned? Why is his name still on buildings, streets, parks? Because the ban was the cover-up. In 1908, when Belgium took control of the Congo, they didn't just reform the system, they buried the story. They made sure that what happened would be difficult to prove, difficult to teach, difficult to remember. No trials, no investigations. That no one held accountable. After World War II, Nazi war criminals faced justice at Nuremberg. The world said, "This must be documented, prosecuted, remembered." But for the Congo, nothing. No Leopold at a defendant's table, no Force Publique officers testifying, no restitution, no reparations. The experiment was banned, the abuses regretted, and then silence. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The Holocaust happened in Europe, to Europeans. The perpetrators were European. The victims were European. It was impossible to ignore because it happened here, in the heart of what the West considered civilization. But the Congo? That was there, far away. The victims were African. The crime happened in a place most Europeans would never see, and so it became possible to forget. Right? And when the Congo is taught, if it's taught, it's framed as a tragic mistake, an excess of colonialism, a failure of oversight. But if this happened today, if a single leader claimed ownership of a country, imposed forced labor, mutilated resistors, and killed 10 million people, we wouldn't call it a mistake. We'd call it genocide. The United Nations Genocide Convention, created in 1948, defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about physical destruction. That's exactly what happened in the Congo. But the word genocide is almost never used, because acknowledging it would require something the world isn't ready to give: accountability. It would mean asking where the wealth went, who profited, who still profits. It would mean tracing the line from Leopold's rubber economy to today's cobalt and coltan extraction, minerals mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo under conditions that echo the past. It would mean admitting that the experiment never really ended. So here's what we need to understand. The most dangerous experiment in colonial history wasn't outlawed because it was evil. It was outlawed because the world saw it, because the photographs escaped, because the whistleblowers spoke, because the silence broke. And the moment that happened, the moment the proof became undeniable, the experiment had to be shut down. Not because of morality, but because of exposure. The ban wasn't justice, it was damage control. Which raises one final, chilling question. If Leopold's Congo was only stopped because it was seen, how many other experiments were never exposed? How many other experiments were never exposed?